Our New Testament scripture this morning is from the Acts of the Apostles, beginning at chapter 9, verse 36. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men with him to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that she had made them while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then, calling the saints and the widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. Holy wisdom, holy word. There was in Joppa a certain woman, a disciple, whose name was Tabitha. Joppa is one of those place names that keeps popping up in Scripture. It's a port city known today as Jaffa, and it's the oldest and southernmost part of Tel Aviv. Its origins go back as far as 7,500 years before Christ. In the Hebrew Scriptures, Joppa is the port in which Jonah, the recalcitrant prophet, boards a ship to go in the exact opposite direction from the direction God is trying to send him. Later on, it's conquered by King David, and that comes in handy when his son Solomon needs to import cedar wood from Lebanon for the purpose of building the temple. Joppa is the port that receives all that cedar. At the time of our story, Joppa was a place where the gospel had gained a foothold. Tabitha lived there, and she was a follower of the way of Jesus. That's what they called Christianity then, the way. She's the first woman in Scripture described as a disciple, although it's pretty clear that she is not the first female disciple. Women were there from the start. Disciple means learner. And one of the things Tabitha learned was the importance of caring for others. Apparently, everyone loved Tabitha. Our story tells us she was devoted to good works and acts of charity. In the original Greek, it says she was full of good works. Good works overflowed from her. And that word that indicates charitable giving, the root of that word is the word that means compassion. Everyone loved Tabitha because Tabitha was filled with compassion. Sometimes it seems like compassion is in short supply. And so we really notice, when someone exhibits it, when someone has it in abundance, it makes an impression. In our story, as soon as we learn about Tabitha, she dies, and the people around her are so shaken, they send for Peter. He's in a town called Lydda, which is actually also a part of modern-day Tel Aviv, so he's not far. Peter's well known. After all, he's one of the original disciples, one of the first followers of the way. And at this moment in our story, he's gaining a reputation as a healer, as a man filled with the power of the Spirit. He comes. When he gets there, Peter walks into quite a scene. Tabitha's community has come out in force. The people who show up for Tabitha are the widows of Joppa. We find them there in the upstairs room, after her body has been washed and prepared for burial. The widows are weeping, but they're also having a kind of a calling hours show and tell. Look, one says, here's a tunic she made me. Look, another one says, she wove this shawl for me. Apparently, Tabitha's way of caring for others involves fibers, needlework, fabric. Tabitha's a maker. And like those who get together to make hygiene kits on our Days for Girls sewing days, Tabitha has devoted herself to this ministry of creating something necessary. In this case, clothing for the community's poorest women, widows. The Hebrew scriptures lift up 3 categories of people who deserve the particular care of the faith community. These are widows, orphans, and aliens, which is to say, immigrants. Widows, if they do not have adult children to help them at this era, are incredibly vulnerable. They can't go out and get work. They're entirely dependent on the kindness of those who have means. Underneath these strong commandments is the memory of when God's people were vulnerable, when they were immigrants in Egypt who were exploited and turned into slaves for generations. That memory reminds them to care for the vulnerable. Care for the widows. It could be your own mother, your own wife who is penniless. Care for the orphans. It could be your own children who are hungry. Care for the immigrants. Your ancestors wandered in lands not their own. Who knows? Someday you may be in the same position. Peter walks into this place where the widows are testifying to Tabitha's loving kindness, her compassion, by showing specific, tangible things that she made for them. Fruits of her labor. This tunic, this shawl, this robe, this blanket. And of course, we do the same thing, don't we? When someone we love passes away, we tell stories about them. We remember the things they did, the things they said, the legacy of their good works, the mark they made through their kindness. We share photographs. We tell stories. We testify. See how they loved us, we tell one another. See how we loved them. See what an Easter person Tabitha was, living Jesus' commandment of loving one another as God has loved us. That's what many of us who loved the writing of Rachel Held Evans have been doing for the past week. This 37-year-old writer of books such as Searching for Sunday and A Year of Biblical Womanhood died on May 4th after a brief illness, leaving 2 toddlers motherless and her husband a widower. She left us without her particular, beautiful, and compassionate voice. A voice that articulated a way of following Jesus that included space for people who had traditionally been excluded. And everywhere this past week, I've been reading stories about Rachel, about people who thought church wasn't for them until they read her particular words of welcome, about people who, when they were discouraged, found particular encouragement in her books or her blogs. People who recounted acts of kindness that were done in private, out of the limelight, but which spoke of her strong, good character. "Look," said one, "here's what she said to me. See," said another, "how her wisdom changed my path." And even in death, Rachel's wisdom offered comfort. She wrote, "There is no ladder to holiness to climb, no self-improvement plan to follow. It's just death and resurrection, over and over, day after day, as God reaches down into our deepest graves. And with the same power that raised Jesus from the dead, wrests us from our pride, our apathy, our fear, our prejudice, our anger, our hurt, and our despair." In our story, Peter listens to the testimony of the widows. Then he sends everyone out of the room and gets down on his knees and prays. He turns toward the body of the dead woman and says, "Tabitha, get up." And she opens her eyes and she sits up, and he offers her his hand and helps her to stand. Then he brings in her friends, the people who have just been grieving her loss so desperately, and he shows them. "See," he says, "she is alive." And in doing this, Peter restores this particular Easter person to her community. He allows her to resume her ministry to those so in need of her care. And he reveals the power of the crucified and risen Christ. I think it's interesting, though, the fact that Peter has been a catalyst for the power of God to be revealed in that moment. There's no talk here of Peter as the Messiah or Peter as the new Messiah or Jesus returned. His work points to Jesus, not to himself. Many believed in the Lord, the story tells us. And spoiler alert, Peter is also an Easter person. We are going to talk about him next week in greater detail. The good Easter people do isn't for themselves, or at least not for themselves alone. It's always for God. It is always for others. Tabitha is known in her community as one who has compassion, one who loves others as God has loved her. We can say the same of Peter's revelation of God's power. He's simply showing the love of God in this moment for this community, this love that brings life out of death. We are still in the Easter season. I'm sure you've noticed. The stories keep returning to death and resurrection. Sometimes, like today, it's a literal death and a literal rising from the dead. But often it's like the death of Thomas's doubt and the new life he finds in the risen Christ when he encounters him in the flesh. Sometimes it's like the death of Saul's harsh pursuit of the followers of the way. There's a use of that word, pursue, in a bad way, kids, if you're paying attention. And his rising to new life as Paul, a follower of the way. It's even like the death of Ananias' fear and the new life he is able to have and give, trusting in God's power. And then there was Tabitha. Everyone loved Tabitha, this Easter person whose literal death and rising brought new life to her community. Tabitha revealed that same love, the love that shows itself in kindness, the love that is the compassion of God for the vulnerable and the suffering, the love that reaches into our own personal graves day by day and brings us back to life. Thanks be to God. Amen.